Good morning. Everybody awake yet? Good morning.
Good morning.
That's a little bit better. Just checking to see how everybody's doing, making sure we're still not too sleepy.
Yeah.
My name's Katie Grigg.
I'm Theresa. It's both of our first DevOxes, so we're really excited to be here. And it's actually Katie's first conference talk ever. So we're really excited for her today.
Thank you. So let's dive in. Our goal for today's presentation is to make these events, today we're talking about open source reliabilities and really how it correlates to COVID-19 pandemic wedding planning. And our goal for today's presentation is to make these events more relatable, to really give you another perspective on how tech really does mirror everyday life examples that we may experience. As two brides who just survived pandemic wedding planning, we saw a lot of similarities between our experiences and what unfolded with the Log4j vulnerability that took place. You may not see the correlation right now, but hang in there, promise. We will explain. I can assure you that this talk is for software developers. Now, many of you in the audience today, some of you may be married, some maybe not. But the point is that, like building applications, pulling off a well-orchestrated event, such as a wedding, is equally as difficult. It takes many different people with different specialties to all come together to pull off an incredible event. Just like an application needs design, UX, dev, testing, QA, SRE, you name it, all to make an app consumer-approved and reliable. In our case, it's pulling off a great wedding that's enjoyable for our guests. But before we dive in, let's talk a little bit about who we are.
So my name's Theresa. I'm a developer advocate at Sonatype. I've been in the Java space for a little while now, working on open source various JDK and compiler projects. And in my current role, I do a lot of work helping open source communities improve their security awareness, much like what we're talking about today.
And my name's Katie Grigg. I'm a reformed salesperson. I'll just be honest, and we'll get it right out there, right? I write no lines of code, but I have been in the tech space for about 10 years now, and I have kind of observed a lot of things. First and foremost, I listen to the community. I spent several years speaking with our customers about the security around dependencies and how to protect their software supply chain. I listen to what problems are troubling, what framework or technologies people are most curious about. What solutions are people looking to? What's new? What's outdated? And more importantly, why are they making the decisions that they're making? The other part is I'm also pretty curious, and it's because of that curiosity of how software development works. I actually started a podcast last February. I'm representing it on my shirt right now. It's called Wicked Good Development. Check it out. And though through that show, my goal is really to have a platform for the open source community to discuss what's most important to them. New ideas, issues, processes, and most importantly, how do you protect your software supply chain? So let's dive in. So the wedding industry tells us to believe that we should achieve and can achieve this Pinterest perfection, right? And social media would agree. So you see all these photos on the left over here, and it's just picture perfect, right? And you think like, yes, that's my design, that's my idea, and it's gonna happen. But the problem is, is that it can be really challenging, and you need to take a step back and recognize that what's being posted isn't actually reality, right? Many assume that people with those perfect photos don't have problems, but in reality they do. It's important to remember that the people behind the lens are often just as stressed and nervous as everyone else. But everybody suffers or feels some of that perfection issue. Tech's the same way, and honestly, I'm very excited that Venkat in his keynote yesterday shared this tweet, because this correlates exactly to what we're talking about, right? You've set the wedding date, but you haven't asked her out yet. So how's that gonna work out? Tech, like many ways, software industry, it also promises the world, but often doesn't deliver. And as luck would have it, we're here to talk about just that today. Again, it's my first talk, guys. I'm a little nervous, sorry.
You're doing amazing.
So what happens, though, is when we overpromise and underdeliver, right, and we look at those Pinterest pictures, reality is that's not what is going on behind the scenes. So as you'll see, I was probably more like Bridezilla over there, just going mental about things, wanting everything to look perfect, right? And it's challenging because you have family with their opinions, you get family politics of who can't sit next to who. You also have money concerns, right? Like, what's your budget? How are you going to afford it? And then in software development, again, it's that overpromise, underdeliver. But the thing is we're humans, and we're never really going to be able to orchestrate large projects exactly as planned every single time. But what you can do is you can start with your requirements, right? You can start with that original conception and design. For me, I don't know how many of you know what this is, but does anyone know what it is? Okay, so this is actually a moon door. This is actually a very unique arch, and apparently it is very difficult to get for a wedding because it's circular. And for me, this was a requirement. So this was something that I was trying to figure out is how do I get this at my wedding? Because this was what I needed. It was a non-negotiable for me. So the thing is understanding your vision and requirements, while it's your first step, you have to think of, okay, so how do I do that? How do I take that picture and idea to reality? And the thing is you really have two ways to look at it. I can either reinvent the wheel and do it myself, or in my case, I would have to ask my parents to figure out how to build that, right? Or I can find a vendor who can do it for me, just like software developers can find third-party components that work for them. So the point is, if you think about it, a wedding is unique to individuals getting married. It's similar to how applications are unique to organizations, right? Each has their own alterations that make it specific to them. You choose components from vendors, where I relied on vendors to perform specific functions that met my needs. Whereas you guys might need X library for Z function, whereas I wanted a florist who could do a moon door. And you'd be surprised, not everybody can do it. So it's tricky to find the right vendor, but it's just as difficult to select the correct component.
So as Katie touched on, much like in wedding planning and software application development, there are a lot of choices, such as, do I buy or use a service, or do I have a DIY or in-house type of solution? The answer can be different depending on the application, but many times the answer is don't reinvent the wheel, don't rewrite and resolve the same problems that have already been solved. And as a result, many applications are using a lot of different dependencies in a big, huge puzzle piece mess that really is the reason that application innovation is as fast as it is today. And it's actually to the extent that looking at modern enterprise applications, actually about 90% of the code that's in there is not from the application developers that are actually writing it, which is quite a lot. So application developers are really relying on a lot of engineers that outside of their own team to be able to orchestrate and make a successful product. And as a result as well, knowledge sharing is amazing, of course, but problems can also be shared, and not every type of component that is always used, especially when it's potentially free, like an open source, is going to be of the same quality all the time. And because build tools are really awesome these days in that they're able to help build things really quickly, and automate a lot of what we don't see under the covers, but as a result, it becomes really difficult to know what exactly is being used in all of these applications. And when there is a potential issue with a dependency, how do you actually go and find that pinpoint that sort of broke the pile? One example that we talk a lot about at Sonatype is the log4j, log4shell vulnerability that happened really recently. And this was a big example of this that I'll kind of get into in a few minutes, but I'm guessing at the Java community, most of you are at least familiar with this library, if not very familiar with the CVE. But this is just an example showing it's a logging framework that is used pretty heavily. This is typically how it's used. The bottom part is me inserting my own data. Teresa's having some Belgian beer. That was me yesterday. been enjoying that. But the Log4Shell vulnerability was all about the fact that it is in fact possible to be able to exploit this logging capabilities by using something in the JDK called JNDI. And if, per se, I was able to get this string instead of my name into that logging file, I'd be able to actually call a remote server to pretty much anywhere I want, grab a class file, deserialize it, now running some potentially malicious code in the JDK. And so what made Log4Shell so terribly bad is because it was pretty easy to exploit in general. Like, this is pretty easy, I think, for just about any programmer to understand. And the other part is that Log4j is a really widely used thing. In fact, on average, there's about 7 million downloads per week of the Log4j package. So it has the potential to impact many, many software projects all at once. And despite this, so one of the things we do at Sonatype is we are the stewards of Maven Central, so we're pretty involved in what's happening in terms of download numbers and who's using what. And it turns out that over a 6-month period after that Log4Shell vulnerability, we graphed it, and it's still showing that approximately a third of Log4j downloads were still vulnerable versions. So we thought, why would that be? I don't think it was due to the lack of publicity. It was published in a lot of major newspapers. My non-technical friends and family were asking me about it and whether or not it had something to do with the Java updates on their computers. For me, that's been about as close as I've been able to communicate my job at times. And so that wasn't it. It wasn't because people were not aware. In fact, there were consequences as well for not patching this. The Federal Trade Commission in the United States issued a warning saying that they would pursue legal action against companies that failed to take responsible steps to protect their consumer data from exposures, such as using a package, a vulnerable version of Log4j. So the real reason that this happened was because of transitive dependencies. Just to make sure we're all on the same page here, when we're talking about direct and transitive dependencies, most of you are probably familiar with these terms. What I really mean is the direct dependency is something that's declared in a POM file that's explicitly being used to fulfill some kind of functional engineering requirement. The transitive dependencies are those packages that get pulled in alongside with that, that those services that you may use depend on. The average application actually has 128 of these direct dependencies. So you can imagine if all of them have several or maybe even hundreds of transitive dependencies, that dependency graph can get pretty hairy pretty quickly. The way I like to think about it is what it really looks like is that, you're getting ready for the holidays and you pull out of your dusty attic a tangled ball of Christmas lights. Nobody wants to deal with that. And really that is the way that it kind of is in a lot of software companies. And it's kind of not far from the truth. A real dependency graph can get really hairy and just look like a big bunch of scribbles. And this is the problem that really led to that Log4j not being remediated, is because it is really challenging to be able to know exactly where those transitive dependencies lie. So in our talk, this is all about comparing our security incidents like this to wedding planning. So Katie, how can we relate this back?
I'm glad you asked. So when Log4j hit, seriously, how many of you felt anxious, scared, confused, up all night, lost sleep, maybe part of your holiday? Anyone? Okay, it was definitely me, right? For COVID and my wedding, right? So March 2020 was a tough time for everyone, right? But if you actually take it back a little bit, we heard rumblings of COVID-19 back in January. And for me, that was when I heard, RSA is a huge security trade show out in the US, and we started hearing companies like IBM, Intel, all backing out of this trade show. So it was at that point that I really knew this was something serious coming, right? And it was something that I knew was coming, but I just didn't know how it was going to affect me yet. To me, it was a wake-up call that things were changing. Again, just wasn't sure. So if you fast forward to March 2022, right, I had no idea what I was going to do. And as you can see, this is a very real email on the right from my caterer to my mother that she left me off because she probably knew I was going to lose my mind, that my wedding was canceled. We were 8 weeks away. So people had booked their travel, they had booked their hotel, they knew what they were doing, right? And at that moment, I had no idea what I was going to do. But it was all because the caterer had been dependent on the rentals. And I didn't even realize it until later. Because I thought it was just a package deal, right? They say, hey, we do all of this stuff. But I didn't know they were actually two separate entities. So without the tables, the china, the chairs, you can't have a wedding. And during COVID in a pandemic, using rentals that are being used by other people, when you don't really understand what's going on at the time, is just not safe for anyone to use. So for me, that's my version of dependency management, right? The caterer relied on the rentals, and it was done. So stress of not smart choices really does provide a headache, right? So for me, it was lost money. I can't even tell you how much money we actually lost on this from just trying to figure out how to right-side it, or sending duplicate wedding invites, or like, oops, we changed the date, or like, hey, we're figuring it out right now. So Minted.com got a lot of my money. I'm sure they love it. But it wasn't like my favorite thing to go through. The stress of telling my family and friends was also that it was canceled was also really difficult. Then you have to add on the other real life social impact is other people, right? So I was supposed to be married in May, and my younger sister was getting married in September. And everybody deserves their moment in the sunlight, right? Their time to shine. So I really had no choice other than to postpone or like elope that week at the courthouse. And it's difficult, right? Like, what do you do? I wasn't sure. And I think for a lot of that is like, do I upgrade? Do I pick a different component, right? You're just not sure. So as you'll see, like the real social impact of what it had on couples is they were also struggling to figure out what to do. And I happened to just fall in that 15%.
Part of the reason that, we came and decided to do this talk together was because, this sort of happened to both of us, but it happened in very different ways where, Katie was like the bad example in a sort of way where the vendors, the things that services she was relying on to orchestrate this event were not really there for her when she needed them to be, and was not set up in a way that was able to respond well to an emergency type of situation. For myself, I had sort of the good fortune, double-edged sword of being aware of this major incident, this sort of log4shell, destroy the world moment for the wedding industry, while I was in the middle of planning. So I was able to make a lot different choices, and my priorities when choosing those services really changed a lot, saying, oh, okay, but what if something does happen? Mm-hmm. Will they still be there for me? And that really made all the difference there, and that's sort of what, needs to happen in terms of software applications too. Like, are you actually prepared for the next time log4shell happens? And the answer we're seeing is not great. So Sonatype did a study on types of dependency updates, and out of 4 million component migrations, about 70% of the time, those components were shown to be suboptimal. And suboptimal means a lot of different things. It's based on a few different metrics, but some range from seemingly obvious things and objectively bad metrics like don't upgrade to a known vulnerable version, to something a little bit more difficult to know, like choosing the same migration path that somebody else has chosen, which is common, because then it's much more likely that the problems that you may face have been seen before and have been hopefully streamlined as well. And that was just a small study as well. Maven Central has 7 million component downloads every week. So that's the potential for a whole lot of poorly chosen component upgrades just in a week. But over the year, that could be billions. So the question that we all really need to be able to answer in these modern day is about applications or things like this. If I were to tell you right now, take a new, maybe like Guava, for example, has a new security vulnerability or something, are you using this exact component and this exact version, and where is it? And which applications across your organization are using it? And can you track the remediation there? How long does it take you to ship or to deploy an update after you've fixed it? These are all things that really matter today. And one of the reasons is because when a new vulnerability gets publicized, there's a high amount of incentive to go and exploit it. So much so that on average, we're seeing scanning can start for these kinds of things to find those vulnerable package in 15 minutes. Meanwhile, it takes an enterprise 12 hours on average if you have all your ducks in a row, if you know where things are. So in order to solve, I shouldn't say solve, but at least be prepared for these types of incidents, the stop the world types of things, there's a lot of different things to consider. So there's choosing new dependencies wisely in the right way, making sure that they really have your back, like my wedding vendors did for me. Knowing what's in your application in the first place and being comfortable with the security stance that's there. Continuously checking for need to upgrade and also new security vulnerabilities. And finally, having a strategy to remediate when something does go wrong. All right, so first on the choosing new dependencies wisely. So there's a lot of different reasons that we may or may not need a new component. Usually it's to fulfill some kind of functional engineering requirement, or there may be some non-functional requirements as well. Another thing to consider, things like training cost and ease of use. If it's an open source project, is it well documented? Is there a community there that's going to help you use it if something goes wrong? Is there paid support if that's something that's important to you? Is the project actively maintained? Does it have a lively community that's hopefully going to stick around for a while? And does it have quality contributions and reviews? Or do they let just anybody contribute, which could open it up for further attacks? And there's always licensing considerations as well, just to make sure you're not going to get sued by anyone. That's never good.
So for me, my guidelines were part of my requirements, right? So for me, what you're looking at is my manual process for how I was picking guidelines for what I wanted out of a vendor for a venue. This is venue specific, right? And I actually did this per vendor we had. So florist, caterer, photographer, I went through the same exercise. So each time my guidelines were a little different based on my needs, and those needs could have been ease of use getting there, making sure it's accessible for handicap, being able to provide that look and feel that I wanted. Did I like the people running the place? Did I feel like they would support me? So as you can see, right from the get-go, some of them were just, red means bad, right? So some of them were immediately canceled because it didn't seem like they were put together. So maybe they lacked documentation, right? Or it didn't look like the property was well kept. But the green ones up top is where you'll see that those were the two that I had picked. So at the top is actually the first one that I thought was, my dream venue. But when COVID hit, it actually changed. So we actually had to move venues. We had to think and kind of change what our guidelines were, and we actually moved to a new venue. And as you'll see, you'll also have like the website cost information, because we were just trying to make sure it was all in one place, and it was actively updated to make sure I had real-time information in case anything changed.
So, this is, again, a good mirror of the types of more functional or, ease of use requirements they have. But then just like in software, there should be some emergency type of measures in place as well, just in case something goes wrong. So for wedding planning, those were, for me, things like, is this refundable? Am I going to get my money back? And then also, if you had clients during the summer of 2020, what was your response and how did you help them? Because that can tell a lot. Same thing kind of goes for components and open source components around security. How does the community react when a new vulnerability comes around? Are they going to have your back in those types of situations? If you're going through the code and doing an audit, is there evidence that developers are actively working to make it more secure? Are they validating their inputs and using security best practices? And so I actually got some of these points from the OSSF best practices for choosing open source dependencies guide. And the number one thing that they ask is, can you avoid using it? So at the end of the day, the more components and the more code that gets used in an application, the bigger the attack surface is and the potential for exploitation. So their suggestion is even that maybe there's a transitive dependency that you have that already fulfills what you need it to do, and it's just there. That could be potentially a reason to choose one project over another. And finally, will it subvert the system? Is this going to make you worse and bring your team down? I had that slide earlier that showed 90% of application code is not, from the application developers, and your team really isn't just your team. It's that whole slew of people that's writing the rest of that 90% of that code. Is that team bringing you down? That's not what you want in terms of security. And there's a lot more these days in open source transparency around choosing these things as well. One of the things that I'm seeing more and more is OpenSSF scorecard, for example, is on a lot of GitHub repositories now. And this also comes from the OpenSSF best practices working group, which exists around helping identify good practices and also educating developers on how to write and maintain secure code. And the scorecard is basically a measure of project health around security and has various tests. Some of them are simple, some of them are a little bit more complicated, but it really is a good way of knowing, does this project care about security and about being prepared to remediate if something happens. All right, so that's a lot about choosing dependencies. But for the existing ones, like I mentioned, it's important to measure when choosing a component. Is this going to bring me down? And in order to know that question, you have to untangle. You have to get that ball of Christmas lights, and you do have to untangle it. I know it's tempting to just leave it in the dust, but it has to happen. And that really comes to dealing with those transitive dependencies that we talked to before, and really dealing with that extra 33% of log4j that has not been remediated. The manual system is clearly not working. We have the data to show that, not only is it slow, but also you're not going to find all the uses potentially of the vulnerable packages in your system. So some of the technology that's come around more recently for this are static composition analysis tools, and there are a whole bunch of companies right now that have these types of tools. You'll see GitHub, GitLab, Sneak, Sonatype has one as well. And these are all really great to help identify the open source transitive dependencies that are being used in a code base. Not only that, but they provide some feedback and recommendations around, are they secure? Are there known vulnerabilities? How insecure are they? Should I upgrade? And to which version? As well as potentially legal compliance, code quality, and even potentially like project health around open source components. They're all a little different. The things I wanted to call out about this is sort of how it works and like what you should look for when you're choosing these types of scanners. So one of the first things that may not always come to mind is that not all scans are really created equal and solving that types of transitive dependency problem. There are quite a lot of scanners for dependencies out there that really do just kind of go to the POM file and say, oh, these are all the things you meant to use. Great. That's all I need to know about. But that's not true. As we've seen, the dependency map can be a little bit more complicated than that. So it is important to look for something that is having a bigger way of scanning, such as an as-observed scan. So one way that this is sometimes done is that the components that are used that are explicitly determined actually get downloaded, and then the system will see, okay, what comes along with this when I download this one thing, for example. So the data behind these tools comes from CVEs typically. Are you guys familiar with this term? Oh wait, that's pretty. I always see less hands than I'm expecting, but I'm glad to see that there are more in this room than some of the ones that I have been in. So this is a long list of publicly disclosed and publicly available security vulnerabilities that exist in software. And they have been at least somewhat proven that they are possible and can work. It's not a theoretical vulnerability. And you'll typically hear me and a lot of security professionals just say CVE, referring to a single vulnerability. And that really includes just an ID, usually a public reference and a description of what's going on there. It's not super detailed. The slightly more useful thing is the scoring system that exists around measuring these things. So it's a score of 1 to 10, where 10 is the most severe, and these scores are based on the ease of exploitation, how easy it is to exploit, and the potential impact that it will have when it is exploited. So Log4Shell, for example, I mentioned earlier, is both easy to exploit and has 7 million downloads a week. So that one got a big 10. All of these are stored, and a lot of these scanning tools are getting their information, especially the free ones, from public databases such as the National Vulnerability Database, and using these scores to basically inform recommendations for remediation. So this is what you might see in one, for example. So at the top, you'll see there are critical issues that I may consider fixing. Those are sort of more of the level 10s. Down below, you might be seeing a list of which exactly is the vulnerable one to be fixing, and some are more automated than others in this sense. Some tools, in fact, will even say things like, critical doesn't just mean between 1 for 10. Sometimes 3 medium vulnerabilities can be just as bad or worse as like 1 level 10, for example. So really what I'm trying to say here is scanning tools vary considerably. And as far as I'm seeing, it really is no perfect tool out there to be used on open source technology. So it never hurts to run more than one scanner, see what comes up, and one of them may just flag something really critical. So in an attempt to solve this problem lately, the security industry has been talking a lot about SBOMs, or software bills of materials. And a lot of this really helps solve that issue of not all scanning tools are really going to know the transitive dependency situation completely well and be able to give me an accurate picture. But that technology, is slowly getting better. So what this basically concept came from the manufacturing industry. And the example I hear most often is with a car. When a car is being built, typically the manufacturers know every single type of component, where it comes from, where it was manufactured, the version number, and so then if something goes wrong with that car and it's discovered that there is a safety hazard, they can do a recall and protect the public safety. That's exactly what this accomplishes in software as well, being able to know and have a list. And so then when a product is, say, sold, for example, or you pick up a library, you can say, oh, here is a great list of exactly what is in this library. So I, myself, can have full transparency around the risk and of all the dependencies that are coming in and that I'm taking on. So as I mentioned, this comes from the manufacturing industry and has a lot to do with the software supply chain as well. So we've taken more things from manufacturing and kind of put this term in terms of the software process to be able to talk about the types of security vulnerabilities that are seen more and more often today. So basically saying that the suppliers are third-party open source components, warehouses are the component repositories, manufacturers are the software development teams, and the finished goods are the software applications. And the SBOM is something that should be taken at each of these steps along the way, basically, to be able to know for sure and track exactly where that software is coming from. So this term, SBOMs, software bill of materials, has been around for a little while, actually, in the software industry. Lately, it's just been something that's been come up more and more because it's something that governments are now actually getting involved in. So in May 2021, the US government proposed a strong stance on improving the nation's cybersecurity, including all along the software supply chain. So this has kind of triggered a stream of events, and that eventually SBOMs will actually be required for anyone contracting to the federal government. What does this have to do with you or any of us? If we don't work for a government contractor, well, as I mentioned before, 90% of applications use third-party dependencies. So this is something that will be and is currently sort of trickling down into the open source communities as well for critical projects that are being used across the software industry. So it is something that likely you will be seeing more and more often. The two major standards that are being worked on right now is Cyclone DX and SPDX. It's not really a question right now of which one should I use, but you will see both, and hopefully at some point in the future they will be kind of interoperable and interchangeable. So these are just something to note. If you see these terms, that's what it means, the SBOM.
All right, back to me.
So weddings also have SBOMs.
So I know nobody would think that a wedding has an SBOM, right? But here is my version of it. So why am I showing you this, right? I'm showing you this because, as you can see, sometimes SBOMs really do, if you're starting out and not sure how to, just getting started with it, sometimes it will look like this. It will be in an Excel spreadsheet, right? So what I did is I put each of the vendors down, right? I said who's in charge, what their emails, what their contact info is, pricing, costs, what I've paid, and what's left. As Theresa pointed out, an SBOM is really all about transparency, and it's knowing each and every component that's needed to build the software application. While it's complex in detail, the SBOM really does provide a catalog of those components. And for me, this was my catalog. I knew all the details that literally were made up of my wedding. It can be this simple, and really this is what enabled me to lift and shift my wedding to a new date in 2021. So while I had to find a new venue, I was able to literally pick up all my vendors, move to a new date and a new venue. It was also a way for me to involve my family, my community. It was the people I trusted, right? Just like you have certain software vendors that you trust in the community to help you out in a tough spot. Like many of you were reaching out on different message boards maybe during Log4j. For me, it was my mom, my sisters, some of my friends who were able to really pick up some of those pieces when I just couldn't. And it's because of this, like I said, I was able to lift and shift my wedding. While I do not have a scorecard, I hope that my SBOM illustrates, just exactly what was going on in overall health of my wedding, just so you can see by what's left to be paid, right? So while I chose to do this manually, I actually could have used a wedding planning tool. Hindsight's 2021, 2021. Hindsight's 2020, right? There are actually platforms out there that will help me be able to put certain timelines, alerts, priorities on things that I was looking to do, just like you all get alerts on, hey, this component has X score, right? And I could have automated all of this instead of making it a calendar on my refrigerator or this spreadsheet.
Yeah, so I think the point Kate is trying to make is like it's okay to just have an Excel spreadsheet. I think in general, I mean, we're working at a security company, so we're seeing this stuff a whole lot more, but going out and talking to the community, a lot of projects are in a place where they're kind of at the crawling stage, not the having SBOMs all the time and having them fully automated, which I'm going to talk about next, but starting small and like making steps to be able to understand these types of problems when they happen, such as an Excel spreadsheet. You have to start somewhere, basically. But that does bring me into my next point, in that these types of technologies are really much more helpful when they are integrated into the software development lifecycle and having some sort of automation going on. And in fact, I didn't get into this earlier, but one of the requirements for those SBOM standards is having the ability to have automation capabilities potentially, and being something that could be friendly in those types of use cases. So in terms of components in general, there's a lot of benefits outside of just security when it comes to upgrading, keeping up with technical debt. As I mentioned earlier, following common upgrade patterns actually leads to being in that category of making a good dependency upgrade choice, because it reduces the risk of regressions and also potentially creates less work when making those upgrades. Could potentially have some hiring capabilities. Engineers like to learn new things. Let us use the new technology. That is always, I think, something that at least new developers look for when joining a team. And of course, security considerations. There is safety in numbers of staying on popular components and popular versions of those. And there's actually some data to back that up as well. So there's approximately three different strategies that organizations have: the living in disarray, the never upgrading, so low update frequency results in low quality outcomes potentially. This is a highly reactive way of dependency management, and especially when it comes to needing to remediate and create and fix something really quickly, that's probably not going to happen very well. It's not scalable, elevated technical debt, and is an increase to security risk. But there's the other extreme as well, which is living on the edge of all of the latest versions. This is much better, does lead to some better results, and has the potential to be more secure. It's always good to stay fresh with the latest technology as well. However, this could inadvertently lead to some security exposure. Always using the latest and greatest sometimes may not be the best tested, or vulnerabilities can get introduced into packages all the time with some heavy use. So, and at the same time, this can also reduce the quality of life for the development team, of creating a lot of continual work that really may not be providing as much benefit as it could be. So a great middle ground is living kind of close to the edge. So this is not a rule of thumb, but in this study, it basically says that 2.7 versions behind the newest one is on average the better one. Again, not a rule of thumb. But this is where scanning tools can, really come in handy to provide some insight into when is actually a good idea to upgrade. Like, be ready to do it, but should I actually make this decision? So the other part of this, is having continuous security scanning as well. And upgrading continuously, but also doing things like I mentioned, using those tools, having continuous security scanning, and continuously creating SBOMs when things get upgraded and change. All right, so we've talked a lot about ways, that's about dependency upgrades, and about how to make those smartly, and how scanning tools are working, and what's happening a little bit under the covers when choosing one. Now you've done it. Let's say organization has a beautiful DevSecOps pipeline. Everything is in place. The final step is to have a remediation strategy, because things are still going to happen. It's never a perfect solution when it comes to cybersecurity or wedding planning.
I mean, no matter how prepared you are, that's kind of the key takeaway here today is no matter how prepared you are, you just need to have a remediation plan, right? Things are going to go wrong. You just don't know when. So for me, I thought I had lifted and shifted my entire wedding and it was going to be, perfect, right? Figured out that whole debacle with the caterer depending on rentals. So we've been having meetings every 2 weeks or, bi-weekly, right? To make sure to get a hold of just a pulse really on what was going on with, COVID and the protocols that were in place, because it was changing all the time, right? So we had to be mindful of that. So I thought I had done all that, but the problem is who is the number one person at a wedding you need outside of the bride and groom? Correct, the pastor. He's the one person I forgot. So that made a very interesting song and dance because I had to now figure out a remediation plan on how I was legally going to get married. And I already had the venue and everything all set, my dress, everybody was coming. So now I had to figure out what to do. So what we did is we had the pastor come to our rehearsal dinner, and he married us then in front of just our wedding party. So it was like 15 people. And we had a family friend marry us the next day. So again, you can keep preparing, and thinking you have it perfect, but things are still going to happen. So you need to be flexible to figure out what you can do. And then to be honest, 3 days later, we're on our honeymoon and my husband lost his ring in the ocean. So things are going to keep happening, guys. It's just how you adapt, right? You just got to be prepared and go with it. And really have a community that supports you.
So at the end of the day, we both got married. We had our happy endings. This is where our analogy falls a little bit flat because, unfortunately, there's a not so happy ending when it comes to cybersecurity and the world we live in, and incentives for creating for hacking is basically only getting worse. And really, in terms of having a remediation strategy, that really starts with being as prepared as possible. So having those SBOMs to make finding vulnerable packages easy when things happen, because they will, keeping close to the edge of dependency upgrades, and trusting that those open source communities that you lovingly chose with security in mind and with knowing that something could possibly happen will support you at the end of the day. So as a conference of developers, I don't expect people here to go and single-handedly put this in place for organizations, of course. A lot of that comes from leadership buy-in, but it is possible to make some small changes, such as Katie's Excel sheet that we saw earlier, starting really small and being the squeaky wheel. And when you see something that could be improved, just bringing it to the attention of the organization. I saw a paper a couple of months ago from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency on securing the supply chain, and it defined an insider threat as a number of various things to the supply chain. But one of the points that they made was a poorly trained engineer. And I don't know about you guys, but I do not want to be this bullet point and be the insider threat that is a potential for a supply chain attack. So another great thing to do when it comes to learning about these things is education. So this is my recommended list on potential things to look at. Some are Java specific, some are not. The Linux Foundation now has a really nice course on developing and designing secure software, which I like, and also wicked good development. This latest podcast right here. Another great thing to do is go to the talk in this room that is just after this, which is by Brian Vermeer, and he will be talking about deserialization exploits when it comes to Java. So a great opportunity to start education already.
The other thing is, too, is if you have a good story or even a good horror story we can all learn from, please see me after this talk. We'd love to learn about it because I'm sure there are more people who can learn from it
Yes.
when we can have it on the podcast.
Exactly. And this is not Brian, but this is one of my coworkers who, as I mentioned, Sonatype runs Maven Central, and he will be talking about how Maven Central is now using SigStore for being able to sign Maven dependency releases. Should be a good talk. So thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear about your adventures in learning about cybersecurity. Thank you.
One last thing, though, is we're just going to take a selfie. This is my first time, so I got to do it. Please entertain me.
Okay.